So, so let's talk about al-Andalus. Very basics of what does it refer to, and then secondly, how does it link back to this topic of conversation here on translation of civilizations?
Okay. We were talking about translations made in Baghdad from many, many neighboring civilizations. And these translations were mainly made into the Arabic language, right? And the Abbasid caliphs had patronized such works. Having said that, Al-Andalus, or also known as Islamic Spain, was ruled by a different family. This family was none other than the Umayyads. The Umayyads had already ruled much of the Muslim world, and they were ousted by the Abbasids. The Abbasids, basically, when they ousted the Umayyads, they persecuted the Umayyads, and they went after the Umayyads to wipe them out completely so that there is no political threat left from the Umayyads. Some people escaped to Spain, which was also part of the Umayyad Empire, right? And it had not yet conquered by it had not yet been conquered by the Abbasids. So one of the individuals who escaped to Islamic Spain or the Umayyad Spain was Abdurrahman I. He is also known as Abdurrahman al-Dakhil. He was the first ruler from the Umayyad Caliphate that became the Umayyad Caliphate later on. He was the first ruler. He established his government. He brought different political factions together. He brought some unity to Islamic Spain while it was going through much turmoil prior to he had arrived, and he brought people together. So he established a very, very powerful system of governance, and thenceforth the Umayyad government of Spain was established. And in the 10th century, one of his descendants, Abdurrahman III, announced his caliphate. Basically, he became a caliph on par with the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, right? So there were two caliphs in the Muslim world, one in Spain, one in Baghdad, and both, of course, were rivals to each other. So while all of this was happening in Islamic Spain, Abdurrahman III died and his descendants continued to govern, they continued to rule. Some of these descendants, they became very much interested in literature, in books, book collecting, basically rare manuscripts from all over the Muslim world, because the hub of learning at the time was the Muslim world. Much of the academic activity in the world was happening in the Muslim world, in the Muslim domain. For over 1,000 years, the Muslim world was the hub of learning on all fields of education. Okay, be it science, philosophy, humanities, literature, all fields of learning were being pioneered in the Muslim world, in particular Spain, and I will explain how that was happening. So caliphs like Hakam the first, they started to collect books. They had agents running around throughout the Muslim world, specifically buying books for the caliph. Now this is amazing. I mean, it may have happened before, but not on this scale. Never before on this scale in human history, such a large number of books was collected in one place. Okay, Hakam had a library of 400,000 volumes. This is in the 9th century. Okay, a library of 400,000 volumes. 40 volumes alone documented the catalog. I repeat, 40 volumes out of those 400,000 volumes documented the catalog of his books. This is how the kings and the caliphs in Spain were encouraging seeking of knowledge and collecting of books and book production for that matter. So if he heard about a book, let's say in one of the texts, or if he read about it, he wanted to acquire it. He didn't want to leave out any book. So he had agents running around throughout the Muslim world, in Damascus, in Baghdad, as far as Samarkand and Bukhara, buying books for the caliph in Spain, and then collecting these books and taking them back to Spain. Unfortunately, a lot of these books may have survived as late as 1492 in the Library of Granada, when the Catholics had burnt it to the ground, unfortunately, after they took the city of Granada from the last Muslim ruler of Spain. So what happened to all these books and how did they actually impact Western Europe at the time? This is something we want to talk about. So Muslims collected books. There were public libraries in Cordoba, 70 public libraries to be precise in Cordoba. And all of these libraries had thousands of volumes for people to walk in and start reading. Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, Muslim scholars were walking into these libraries. They were picking up books. They were reading and writing and producing translations. So how was this knowledge translated, this Arabic knowledge in the Arabic language on different fields of education? How were these texts basically being transferred to Western Europe? How did that happen? This started in the 11th century when the Christians from the north, they started the Reconquista. Reconquista basically means the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, the reconquest of Spain, or Islamic Spain and Portugal put together. So some Christian monarchs from the northern regions, they started to take the land back from the Muslims. Muslims became very much involved in luxuries, and their lives became very, how can I put it, easy. They were not battle hardened. They didn't pay much attention to the military progress, and that caused them to become weak in comparison to battle hardened Christians in the north who were living in tough environments, very, very hard environments. So they were more tough. They were tougher in the battlefield than the Muslims were. The Muslims had become very soft because of the culture in Spain. Almost every Spanish Muslim was a poet, a scholar, or in love with someone, for example. Yeah, they were writing romantic poetry. So they became very cultured to a fault, basically, that they couldn't even defend themselves. They had created a beautiful culture, a beautiful civilization. Some of the best poets and philosophers were produced in Spanish cities. Even Jewish scholars and intellectuals are produced in these cities because of the culture and libraries and the book production and the culture of books in these cities. While in the north, the Christians were very much ignorant of these sciences and this knowledge, so they started to take land from the Muslims. So in 1085 CE, the city of Toledo fell into the hands of Christian monarchs. Okay, and then with this city came a large library the Muslims or the Arabs had collected in the city of Toledo. Now, when the Christians came across these books, they were completely blown away. They were completely fascinated by this knowledge. And the Christian kings at the time, the Catholic kings, they knew that the real source of power for the Muslim civilization is these books. These are the books that made the civilization of Islam so superior, okay, and so impressive and fascinating. So let's start to read these. Let's read these books. What's in the books? So some Latin Arabists came forward to translate these works. One of them was called Gerard of Cremona. There were many, many people who had learned the Arabic language from Western Europe at the time to translate these Arabic works. There were people from Britain, people like Robert of Ketton, okay, Michael the Scot, for example, okay. Petros Alfonsi was a converted Jew, a Jewish convert to Christianity. He knew the Arabic language. He started to translate some of these books. One figure in particular who stands out in all of this is a man called Gerard of Cremona, okay, who was active in the 12th century, in 1100s, right? He had translated over 82 works. Some of his translations can still be found in Spanish libraries. He translated books from Arabic to Latin, and the reason he was doing this was to bring this knowledge to the Europeans at the time, who were very backward in his eyes. He even wrote about this, that I feel sorry for my brethren. They need to have this knowledge so that they can civilize themselves, right? And a lot of other people did the same. Adilard of Bath was another man, a British man, who had traveled throughout the Muslim world extensively. He had brought a lot of these Arabic works to Britain. Also, another man called Daniel of Morlaix, who was an Englishman, he took a lot of these works from Islamic Spain to England, to Britain, and these works were used to established libraries in France, in Britain, and in cities of Germany, right? So, and even in Italy, for example, the University of Naples in the 13th century was using Islamic works translated from Arabic to Latin. They were using these works. In the libraries or universities of Paris in the 11th and the 12th century, Muslim astronomy was taught. Likewise, in universities, the schools of Oxford and Cambridge at the time, in the 12th and the 13th century, Muslim works or the Arabic works were taught, right? And one book in particular I recommend, I highly recommend this work, which is very, very important, which documents a lot of these things. It is titled The Hidden Debt to Islamic Civilization. The Hidden Debt to Islamic Civilization. This is what this work looks like. So you can read this book. It's a small encyclopedia of information on this very topic, how the Muslims had changed the educational landscape of Western Europe within 2 to 3 centuries. There are other works I would like to mention, regional works focusing on regions. For example, there is a book titled The Matter of Araby in Medieval England. The Matter of Araby in Medieval England. The book has been authored by a lady called Dorothy Metzlitsky. Dorothy Metzlitsky has authored this book, an excellent book as to how Arabic sciences, Arabic knowledge impacted British intellectual development in the 12th and the 13th century in particular. And there are other works I can mention, maybe works of Charles Burnet, who specialized in influence of Islam on Western Europe. Okay, there are other works I can mention, works like George Sarton, An Introduction to the History of Science. This book was published from 1927 to 1940s in 5 chunky volumes. A lot of the Muslim legacy is discussed in this very work of George Sarton, titled Introduction to the History of Science, and many, many more books I can talk about in this regard. Okay, maybe we can add a book recommendation, a list of books to the video when we are done with this. So a lot of these works in the Latin language, they came to Western Europe, and European scholars studied these Islamic works, Islamic science, and then they adopted a lot of these theories, and then these theories were taught throughout the universities in Western Europe at the time. And then later on came the Renaissance. The Renaissance is directly influenced from the Arabic sciences that were taught in Spain and Sicily, right? One of the scholars who wrote on this topic is George Saliba, Professor George Saliba, who has published a book for the Columbia University Press, and his book's title is The Arabic Origins of the European Renaissance. The Arabic Origins of the European Renaissance, or something like that. George Saliba is the author. He has specifically written on the science of astronomy, how it impacted Western Europe, coming from places like Spain and Sicily, and by extension from Baghdad and Damascus. Because the knowledge that came to Spain and Sicily came directly from places like Baghdad, Bukhara, Samarkand, okay, some of the Persian cities, and some of the Middle Eastern cities like Damascus and Cairo. Okay, this is where book production was taking place on a massive scale. A lot of scholars are producing researches, independent works. Some people claim that the Muslims had copied verbatim from the Greeks and other civilizations. This is a misconception. Actually, Muslims had not only copied from the Greeks, they had produced original researches. They had corrected the Greeks on many, many things. Muslim scholars and scientists and intellectuals conducted their own experiments. People like Jabir bin Hayyan, his chemistry is not Greek, strictly speaking. People like Abul Qasim al-Dahrawi from Spain, who invented surgical instruments, his instruments were not necessarily Greek in origin, right? People like Ibn al-Haytham, right? His theories on optics and his theory on medical issues, his theories are not necessarily inspired by Greek works. Of course, he took a lot of knowledge from the Greeks, but then a lot of these Muslim scientists realized that these Greeks or Greek authors had made major mistakes. They had errors in the books. So the Muslim scholars corrected those errors and produced their independent researches. As late as the 18th century, I'm not exaggerating, as late as the 18th century, Muslim works were taught in Europe. Okay, the book of Ibn Sina, Al-Qanun, it was a compendium on medicine, right, or prescriptions for certain diseases, right? This book, Al-Qanun, also known as Canon, was taught in Europe as late as the 17th century, 1600s. This book was still being taught. So the relationship between Islam and the West is very, very tight. It is very, very positive. People mostly talk about conflicts and misunderstandings and periods like crusades, but they don't talk about the cross-pollination of ideas that took place between the Muslim world and the Western world. The positive history between Islam or the Islamic civilization and the Western civilization outweighs by far the negative history of both sides of the world.
Absolutely. That was a lot of good information there, and definitely we'll provide a list of recommended readings for sure on this.